Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and thank you for turning up. And I'm very lucky to be here in a number of ways, but not least of which is because I did survive a sudden cardiac arrest. And I've done this talk a couple of times. I was asked to talk about a real showstopper, because for those of you who don't know, I was the original Yellow Wiggle, and I suffered a sudden cardiac arrest at the end of a performance by the Wiggles. So it kind of stopped the show, but it ironically didn't, because as I collapsed at the side of the stage, the show had finished, but we were intending to do an encore. So whilst I was on the floor having CPR provided, the rest of the Wiggles were out the front of the curtain doing the encore for the crowd that had been chanting hot potato, which is one of our songs. And so the guys didn't want to disappoint. So whilst the other Wiggles were out the front entertaining the crowd, there were people behind the curtain saving my life, which was quite incredible. So that's why this talk is called A Real Showstopper. But it's an interesting thing to say, I survived a sudden cardiac arrest. I'm a survivor. I've kind of stopped calling myself a survivor now, because when we think about survivors, we think about somebody like Bear Grylls, you know, somebody who's dropped into the jungle or the wilderness or the desert, and he has to get out. He has to survive. So how does he do that? Well, he does it because of his own skills and his own knowledge. And there I am in hospital after surviving a sudden cardiac arrest. But my survival had nothing to do with anything that I did or anything that I knew. In fact, at that point in time when I dropped dead and needed to be resuscitated, I knew nothing about cardiac arrest, even though my wife is a cardiac nurse and spends her days in a cath lab putting stents in people's hearts and arteries to open them up to help them live, to help them survive. Again, somebody with skills and knowledge helping others survive. Well, this is the moment that I had a cardiac arrest. Now, just to be clear, and hopefully everybody in this room knows, the difference between a heart attack and a cardiac arrest. Can I have a show of hands? Do you know the difference between heart attack and cardiac arrest? I'm glad I saw that over there. All right, so some people may not. All right, so a heart attack, and please feel free to interject and correct me if I'm giving an incorrect interpretation here, but a heart attack is a plumbing problem of the heart. So our heart has arteries inside the heart that deliver blood, oxygen-enriched blood, to the heart muscle. And it helps the heart do its job, to help it keep pumping blood around our body. So a heart attack is a narrowing or a blockage of one or more of those arteries inside the heart. And it can have severe consequences if it's not dealt with straight away. Now, that's the plumbing problem, that's the heart attack. A cardiac arrest, cardiac means heart, and arrest means stop. So a cardiac arrest is when somebody's heart stops beating, it stops pumping. So in the case of a heart attack, even though there's restricted blood flow to the heart muscle, the heart's still pumping. It's still pumping blood around the body, albeit maybe a little bit inefficiently, and that can cause problems as well. But the heart is still pumping, it's still beating for that person. So their brain is being perfused with blood, their lungs are being perfused. So they can talk, they can breathe, they can move. They might be in some discomfort, and if that heart attack goes on for too long, it can cause very severe problems. The cardiac arrest, though, because that person's heart has stopped beating, it's no longer pumping blood around the body. So the brain is not being perfused, the lungs are not being perfused. All the major organs of the body are not being perfused. The body does not work. That person cannot breathe, they cannot talk, they cannot move. In fact, that person in cardiac arrest will die within minutes if the appropriate treatment is not provided. Welcome, Frank. Good. That's all right, mate. Good to see you. No, that's all right. The Honourable Frank Pangallo, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So, heart attack, plumbing problem, cardiac arrest usually can begin as an electrical problem with the heart. So, plumbing and electrical. And the significance of the electrical part of this problem is what we'll talk about later when we talk about the AEDs. Now, just to confuse you even more, my cardiac arrest was caused by a major heart attack. All right? So heart attacks can lead to cardiac arrest. Not all heart attacks will result in cardiac arrest, and not all cardiac arrests are caused by heart attacks. Are we following that? I hope I haven't confused you all. There is a difference. They can be linked, not always, but sometimes. So that was me going into cardiac arrest. As we finished the show, we finished the last song, we were going to do the encore, as I said, the show felt normal to me. Does anybody know the Wiggles? Put up your hand if you've seen the Wiggles before. Okay, so, all right, thank you, good. So you've got a bit of an understanding then. So a Wiggles show is quite energetic, and it's a lot of moving around, and it's quite exhausting. So for me to feel tired, unwell, like I want to lie down, is not unusual sometimes if I do a Wiggles show, particularly the older I get. And so this is when we were old, we're the old Wiggles, the OG Wiggles. I call us the old guy Wiggles, the OGs. So when I felt tired, and at the end of this show I went to pick up a drink of water that was on the ground, I collapsed. Didn't seem out of the ordinary to me. But the problem was I'd had a massive heart attack. But there's none of that kind of clutching at the chest, staggering around. I did not feel unwell. I did not feel crushing pain. I felt nothing other than tired and exhausted. But I suffered that sudden cardiac arrest. And here's getting back to what I was saying about being a survivor. Not because of anything I did. I lay there. I couldn't do anything. My heart had stopped beating. I couldn't move, I couldn't talk, I couldn't breathe. But other people did something. They started this thing that we call the chain of survival. They were able to identify that I wasn't breathing. Well, sorry, I'll backtrack. They were able to identify that I was not responding. So they called 000. First thing you do, somebody's not responding, call 000. Then, if that person is not breathing normally, then you start CPR. And even better than just calling 000 when someone's not responding, send for an AED at that point, an automated external defibrillator. Because even if that person isn't in cardiac arrest at that point, they may go into cardiac arrest. So having that defibrillator or AED on hand more rapidly is vitally important if that person goes into cardiac arrest. But for me, I was already in cardiac arrest. So I wasn't responding, called 000, wasn't breathing, they started the CPR. And thankfully, there was an AED at the venue where I was performing. So now, rather than saying that I survived a sudden cardiac arrest, I tend to say that I was successfully resuscitated by other people because they did the hard work. I couldn't do anything. They did what was needed to be done so that I could say I'm a survivor, but thanks to them. And a lot of people will say, gee, you were lucky. Yeah, bloody oath I was. I was incredibly lucky. Everything went right for me. They were able to call, push, shock. That is why I survived. Not through good luck, but actually through good design. Now, here are some of the people that played a part in my chain of survival. I'll start down the bottom here. These are, well, I think there's probably a pointer. No, okay. Oh, don't know what I've done there, but anyway. These are what I call my angels. The guy in the green shirt, that's Jeff Wiggle. He normally wears a purple shirt. He didn't do anything. He sang Hot Potato with the guys out the front. Let's ignore him. He got on with the show, which is good, you know. Entertainers need to make sure that the show must go on. And he did. But standing in front of me there on your left as you look at the picture is Steve Pace. Now, he was the drummer for our group that night. He was drumming. He did an hour and 20-minute set with us on the drums, which is hard work. Then next to him is Grace Jones. Now, Grace is a nurse, a cardiac nurse, and she came along to watch the original Wiggles perform with her brother. She wanted to relive her happy childhood. And there she is stepping up on the stage at the end of the night, saving the life of some bloke in yellow. Thankfully, she did what she did. Next to Grace is Kim Antonelli. She was an employee of the Wiggles at the time. She was a new employee. She'd only been there 3 months, and thankfully they hired the right person for the job. Little did she know that her job would include resuscitating a yellow Wiggle. But she did an incredible job, and next to Kim is Therese Wales, again, a member of the audience. Therese is a GP. She came along to the show with 2 of her daughters, again, reliving their fond memories of watching the Wiggles. And one of her daughters saw me collapse and said, "Mum, Greg doesn't look too well. You better go and check if he's all right." So Therese came up onto the stage, and Therese, from what I understand, was the first person to come to my aid. So she somehow made her way up onto the stage past security, tight security at a Wiggles show, obviously. Well, thank goodness we didn't have tight security, because Therese came over. And initially, Therese thought that I was having some kind of fit or seizure. Because sometimes when people go into cardiac arrest, it can look like they're shaking and quivering. And that's what Therese thought. So she rolled me onto my side. Then Kim, the blonde-headed woman, came along. She identified that I wasn't breathing. That's when they started the CPR. So Kim and Therese started the CPR while Steve is still over on the drum kit playing hot potato. Now, Steve is a very religious man, and he swears to God, well, quite appropriately, he swears to God that God spoke to him while he was drumming and said, "Steve, get off that drum kit and go and help that man." So Steve finished drumming hot potato, he got up and came to my aid, and Steve took over and did the rest of the CPR until the defib arrived. And that's where Grace comes in. So Grace comes up onto the stage as a nurse and says, "Can I help?" She gets down, does a little bit of CPR with Steve, but luckily the security guard turns up with the AED and hands it to Grace and Therese, our 2 medically trained people. So Steve and Kim, lay people, had done first aid training, so they knew a bit about CPR and what to do. However, our 2 medically trained people, a GP and a cardiac nurse, were handed the AED, and they both looked at each other and said, "What do we do with this?" Because they were used to hospital-grade defibrillators, much like what our friends in the ambulance would use. An AED, or automated external defibrillator, is not the same thing that we see in the back of an ambulance or in the hospital. It's a different device. It is designed specifically for us, lay people, to use. In fact, it's so simple that a medically trained person can work out how to turn it on and get it working. Thank goodness. Because Grace worked out to turn the power button on, listen to the instructions and follow the instructions. It talks to you, it tells you exactly what to do. And as Josh said, it can't shock you unless you need to be shocked. It becomes the team leader in this situation. It will only deliver a shock to a person who is what we call shockable, a person who's in a type of cardiac arrest who will benefit from the shock delivered from the AED. Now, the other people I need to mention there, the guy doing the wiggly fingers up the top left there with the glasses, that's Brian Parcell. He's a Chief Inspector of New South Wales Ambulance, and as it turns out, he's actually a neighbour of mine. Funny story. Well, funny because I survived, I can say this. It's funny. It's a quirk of life. But my parents were at the show, at the Wiggles show, watching us perform, and they knew that something was wrong. So they made their way up onto the stage, and lo and behold, they get behind the curtain and see resus happening on their son. Later on, the ambulance turns up. Brian comes along and says to my dad, "Now, look, unfortunately, we're going to have to send your son a bill for this. What's his address?" And Dad says, "Oh, look, I don't know what his address is." And Brian says, "Don't worry, I think I know." Because Brian lives literally 2 minutes from where I live, and he walks his dog past my house every day. So he knew where I lived. So I see Brian quite often now, which is quite funny, because prior to that, I'd never seen him in my life. And it's just weird how life, in our lives, things happen and we cross paths with people for certain reasons. And things happen for a certain reason. And up the top right, that's Pramesh Kovoor, Associate Professor. That's Josh's dad. And that's how I came to know Josh, through Pramesh. He was the on-call cardiologist at Westmead Hospital the night that I went into cardiac arrest. And Pramesh played his role in my chain of survival. So there we have it. the chain of survival from lay people through to professionals, saving people's lives. Everything went right for me because of what they knew and what they did. It was decisions that they made. So my angels, they made the decision to become a nurse or to become a GP. They made the decision to get first aid trained. And those decisions helped to empower them to spring into action when needed. It was a decision by the Castle Hill RSL Club, the venue that we were performing at, to purchase an AED 10 years prior, luckily. Hadn't been used in 10 years, they told me, but thankfully it still worked at the time that it was needed. So it's through good design that people are able to survive cardiac arrest. It should not come down to luck. It has to come down to design. And we can design this together, thanks to people like Frank, who are making laws about making these devices more accessible to people when they need them. That is good design. It should not be good luck. Because this here is the chain of survival. Call. Not responding? Call 000 and send for an AED. Not breathing normally? Push. Start CPR. And use that AED as soon as it arrives, because that AED will shock the heart. And remember, I was talking about plumbing, heart attack, electrical problem, cardiac arrest. If that person's heart is able to be shocked because there's electrical activity still going on, it's the shock from the AED that will enable that heart to start up again under its own steam. I don't want to ignore our friends, the paramedics here, a very vital link in the chain. Now, we can do those first 3 links in the chain. Our friends from the paramedics, the ambulance service, they can push and they can shock as well. But I'm sure that they would support this statement I'm about to make. If members of the public get involved in that second link, push, and if members of the public get involved in that third link, shock, when they turn up, their job is made a lot easier. Look at the nods. I didn't pay them. But it's true. Every paramedic I talk to says if we get the community's support, not just to call 000, but to start pushing on the chest. And you don't need to be trained. You don't need to be qualified to do CPR. Anyone can do it. If you call 000, they'll coach you through what to do. They don't say, excuse me, I need to ask first, are you first aid trained? Do you know how to do CPR? They don't, because you don't need to be qualified. You can take photos, yeah, no problem. The same with an AED. No training required whatsoever, because it talks to you, it tells you what to do, and it will only deliver that shock if it needs to be delivered. And the paramedics, now, I don't know enough about what they do, because when they turn up, well, when they turned up to me, they tried to put a tube down my throat, and apparently I vomited everywhere. It's not a very pretty scene, yeah, sorry guys, I didn't make it easy for your blokes in New South Wales. But they administered drugs, and talking about that shock, actually I'll save this comment for a bit later, but just to say this, the stuff that they do is stuff that we cannot do. Like I said, they can do the push and the shock if they need to, but if we do that first, their job is made more easy and more lives can be saved, because if we wait too long to deliver that shock, it's a lot harder for them to do the fancy stuff that they do with drugs and all sorts of other things to try and save that person's life. Then, of course, there's the hospital care, and that's where Josh's dad came in to put one stent into my heart to open up one of the major arteries that caused me to go into cardiac arrest. Now, my story about this all began on my 48th birthday. Now, at that point in time, I thought that I was fit and healthy, because I was exercising a lot, I was playing a lot of sport, I was going to the gym, I was walking 7.5 Ks every day, and I could do that walk in about an hour. So it was a pretty brisk pace. And I had none of the typical warning signs or symptoms that they tell you to look out for if you're at risk of having a heart attack. No chest pain, no fatigue, no pain in the jaw, no pain in the left arm, nothing. I thought I was fit and healthy. Then the very next day, after my 48th birthday, was that OG Wiggles concert I was talking about. And this photo was taken at about 8:55 p.m. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, this happened. That's that photo I showed you before. And that's about 10 p.m. on that night. So I suffered a massive heart attack that sent my heart into cardiac arrest. It was so sudden. Like, I do remember going to get that drink, and I remember rolling onto my back, and I remember feeling tired, and I do remember taking what could have been my last breaths. And then I just blacked out, and that was it. So it is that sudden. This is the point, like Josh was saying. It can be your friend, it can be your family member, it can be somebody in the street. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's why we do need to be prepared to respond as a community, because, you know, my risk factors were these. My blood pressure was 120/80. I had no family history, no diabetes. BMI was 22.5, a little bit high, and I'm probably back to being a little bit high again now. I need to take some time out and slow down from doing some things and focus on my health again. The cholesterol at the time of my cardiac arrest was 4.5. So based on all of those risk factors, if I'd have seen a GP on that morning of my cardiac arrest, they most likely would have said, you know what, for 48, you're not in bad shape. You're pretty good. However, I dropped dead. But for people that knew what to do, I would not be here today. Now, getting to hospital, it's all a blur. I woke up at the venue because the AED resuscitated me and got me back, but I don't remember being there. I remember being in hospital, and the first thing that I can really remember clearly was waking up in the bed in the ward, and there was a nurse sort of stuffing around with the bed, tucking the sheets in and doing something. And I came to, and he looks up at me and says, "Wow, you're a very lucky man, aren't you? Only 10% of people survive what you've been through." And at this point, I'm still a bit dazed and whacked out. And I thought, what's he talking about? And then he said, "And by the way, you're going to have very sore ribs from where they did CPR on you." And that was the moment that I realised that I'd been through something pretty horrendous. I still didn't really comprehend and grasp the full totality of it, but I knew that if somebody's doing CPR on you, things aren't very good. So I was extremely lucky. Now, much to my horror, they were stripped of their royal titles. No, that's not what this slide is about. This slide is about the very first thing that I saw on TV when I woke up on the Sunday morning. So the concert was the Friday night. Saturday was pretty much a blur, a write-off totally. Sunday morning, I put on the TV and Weekend Sunrise came on. And I kid you not, I turned the TV on.
Grace, you're just in the audience because you're a Wiggles fan.
Yeah.
You're there with your
family. Yeah.
You're one of 6 kids. Your mum's a nurse. Your grandmother's a nurse.
Yeah.
Go to the nurse.
Thank goodness you went along to the concert.
I mean, but it's totally different when it's out of your hospital environment.
Yeah, so
I mean, how
different.
scary was it for you?
It was really scary, yeah, because it's not at my hospital, so there's not people around me that can help, and there's not the equipment, and I was having to do a lot of it myself, which was really scary. So
Brian said yesterday, when you arrived, Brian, she nailed it.
Yeah, look, I was very, very impressed with the resuscitation efforts from the Wiggles team. But I think the saviour of the day was the defibrillator, and Grace having the courage to come forward and actually use a defibrillator, given all the people that were in the crowd, to step up and actually save the life.
It'd be easy to be paralysed at that moment and not do anything, Grace, so it is extraordinary.
Yeah, I'll leave that there. I didn't want to play too much, but just to give you enough of a sense of the people that played their part and the commendation from Brian as a paramedic, again, reinforcing the message, just step up and do something. But importantly too, to acknowledge that even for a nurse who does this sort of stuff, not every day, she's not doing full resus on people necessarily every day, but for her to admit that I was out of my comfort zone. It's not easy to do it. It is simple. Call, push, shock. I can stand here and say to you, if you see someone collapse, 3 simple things that any one of us can do. Call, push, shock. But when push comes to shock, it's not always easy to do. It will be emotionally confronting. But you know what? These people did something, and the something that they did saved a life. They didn't have to go to bed at night thinking, should I have done something? Even if an attempt to save a life is made and that life can't be saved, and we can't save every life, we know that. But if you do something, it is better than doing nothing. And that is one of the key messages. Now, what I didn't know before I dropped dead, I didn't know that people can drop dead in public, even though my wife is a cardiac nurse. She'd come home and tell me about her day, and she'd say, well, we did 5 stents. We had one guy come in through emergency. He had a major heart attack. But she'd never sort of said he dropped dead first and then had to come in and have a stent. Maybe the patients that she had seen didn't drop dead, but I wasn't aware of this. I didn't know that CPR is not only used for drowning. I'm used to watching Baywatch and Bondi Rescue. I see them doing the CPR on people who've drowned. I didn't know people drop dead and need to be resuscitated by lay people. I didn't know that any attempt at resuscitation is better than no attempt, and I didn't know that you cannot hurt someone who needs CPR, because it doesn't get any worse than that. Broken ribs are not worse than being dead. I can testify to that. And when I woke up in hospital with the broken ribs, I was very glad that I had those broken ribs. But I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about CPR and AEDs. And if the shoe had have been on the other foot that night, if it was somebody else who collapsed in front of me, I would have thought, I shouldn't do anything. I'm not trained. I'm not qualified. What if I hurt them? I did not know. So this, pardon the pun or the analogy, was a big wake-up call for me. I learnt so much. And I want everyone to understand this, because we can have so many more people surviving sudden cardiac arrests. I'm not going to pretend that we can save everyone, and our friends from ambulance, they'll nod in agreement. We can't save everyone, we know that. But we can save a lot more people with a community that are prepared to call push shock. I didn't know the survival rates were so low. Now that's what we call overall survival. That's all sudden cardiac arrests, traumatic cardiac arrests, that's medical cardiac arrests. Now, for 50 to 70% of people that suffer a sudden cardiac arrest, that is their diagnosis of heart disease, like me. I didn't know I had heart disease. My heart disease was diagnosed with a cardiac arrest. And it's only that I survived that Josh's dad was able to take a look inside of my heart and go, oh, there's a major blockage there, let's fix that. Again, it sounds simple. I know it's not. It's medicine, and it's very complex, and it's intriguing. But the fix, so that I can be here now, doing what I do with no impairment, no impediment to my life, is amazing. And here's what I was astounded to know, because I'd never heard of an AED, I'd never seen one in the community, I was oblivious to it. But this stat blows me away. An AED used within the first 3 to 5 minutes after collapse can result in survival rates as high as 70%. Yet, as I said before, overall survival is about 10%. And it was actually the South Australian Ambulance Service Cardiac Arrest Report that first alerted me to that stat. Now, I think it was 72% in your report in 2017, but I read the report and it said when an AED was used on someone within 3 to 5 minutes, the survival rate was 72%. I'm pretty sure it was 72%. So I did more research. I thought about this. I thought, okay, well, how can we make sure that we can get more people surviving? We're not going to get 70% survival, but if we can double survival rates, if we can triple survival rates, that would be massive. It would be amazing. I did more reading. I found a trial in Italy where they populated a province of Italy with AEDs. They didn't train the community in how to do CPR. They just put more AEDs into the community and they tripled the survival rate. They tripled it. These devices are incredible in the hands of people like us, let alone in the hands of our friends from ambulance. Now, in cardiac arrest, time matters. You'll notice that previous slide said, if an AED is placed on a patient within 3 to 5 minutes, time is the crucial thing. And this is why time matters, because somebody who's in cardiac arrest, that electrical problem of their heart is causing absolute chaos. The electrical impulses are jumping around the place. The heart is not being told how to beat. Those electrical impulses should be telling the heart how to beat and pump blood around the body. Instead, chaos is happening. That's not a normal heart rhythm. And over time, that electrical rhythm there will start to deteriorate. It gets narrower and narrower and will eventually become what we call flatline, or what our friends call asystole. And when a patient gets into that asystolic state, or that flatline state, there's no longer any electrical activity going on inside the heart, which is really important to understand, because the AED will only be able to restart that patient's heart whilst there is some electrical activity going on. And I'll illustrate this. This is the ECG strip from the AED that saved my life. Incredible device. Not only can it save your life, but it can print out the data that smarter people than me can take away and learn from. But what I can see on this, up the very top there, it's very small, but it says pads on. It's the second thing that's written on that very top line. It says pads on. That's where the pads were placed on my chest, and the AED started to do its work. It analysed my heart rhythm. And it said, oh, this guy, that's not a normal heart rhythm. That's what we call ventricular fibrillation. This guy needs to be shocked. So within, 15 seconds? Within 15 seconds, that first shock is delivered about halfway through the second line there. You can see that big spike, that's the shock from the defib. And then after a little bit, my heart goes back into VF. I'm still not in a normal rhythm. But have a look at how broad that VF rhythm is again. It's broad. Before that, look how narrow it is, drifting towards what they call asystole. If I had have got to asystole, the defib would not have shocked me, and it would have been up to our friends' colleagues in the other state over there in New South Wales to do their damnedest to get me back. Now, that broad VF continues, and there's 2 pages of boring VF that I've taken out of there. But have a look down, the second last strip on the right-hand side, it's broad VF up until about the second last border thing. I don't know what you call that. What do you call that thing there? The line. It starts to go fine again. You'll see how fine it gets. And then on the last line, it gets very, very fine. And luckily, the 2-minute cycle of the AED had done its thing, and it's read my heart rhythm again and said, okay, let's shock him again. And bang, that was the shock that got me back, just as the paramedics were arriving. It made their job a lot easier. They didn't have to get out their drugs, their adrenaline and whatever else they have to use. They didn't have to work hard because my heart was beating on its own again. And that is the incredible thing about these devices when put into the hands of lay people, combined with the ability to do CPR, which helps maintain that VF rhythm. It helps keep the heart shockable. And the AED can do its job. And then our friends, the more qualified friends, can come along and do their job and play their part in the chain. This is why I do what I do today. About 3 months after surviving the sudden cardiac arrest, or 3 months after I was successfully resuscitated, I started up a charitable initiative called Heart of the Nation to raise awareness about the location of AEDs in the community. Because after I came out of hospital, I went to my local Bunnings, and I'm standing in line at the Bunnings store, and I see over on the wall a cabinet, and it said AED. I thought, oh my gosh, what a coincidence. I was just resuscitated with an AED, and now they've bought one and put one there. That's amazing. So I said to the girl behind the desk, I said, how long have you had the AED on the wall? She said, maybe 18 months, 2 years now. I said, really? I said, so that's been there that long? I'd been to that store many, many times, and I'd never noticed the AED on the wall. And this comes back to that slide that Josh showed before. the white cabinet that says AED on the side, and it's got a plus sign on it. I thought that was a first aid cabinet. Not knowing about any of this stuff, to me, a white cabinet on the wall with a green and white sticker and a plus sign means first aid. I had no idea. And that's why I wanted to create greater awareness about AEDs in the community. This is about helping the community design good outcomes. Like I said, it shouldn't come down to luck. We need to do more as a community and work together to design these good outcomes. We need to get more people understanding that any attempt at resuscitation is better than no attempt. We need to get more AEDs into the community, make them visible, make them accessible so they can be accessed when needed, and make sure that they are actionable, make sure they're rescue ready. And I want to acknowledge a friend here down the front, Bill. Bill from National Pharmacies. Now, National Pharmacies reached out to Heart of the Nation and said, we like what you're doing. We want to help. We want to help the community. National Pharmacies are putting in 24/7 publicly accessible AEDs at their stores. Big, bright yellow cabinets like the one you saw earlier in Josh's slide. Accessible any time of the day or night for anyone in the community. They're not locked away in the store. They're on the outside of the store. And Bill was telling me, how long ago was this, just a couple of weeks back? About the one that was accessed at the shopping centre there? 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, a security guard from a shopping centre took the AED out of the cabinet because it's not locked. Anyone can grab it and take it when needed. And they did. Thankfully, it wasn't actually needed to shock a patient. But the security guard, number one, knew where it was. It was accessible, and he knew when it might be needed. So if it was needed to be used to shock someone, it was there, it was visible, it was accessible, and it was actionable. It was rescue ready. And that is the beautiful thing that National Pharmacies are doing. And what they're doing is also supporting Heart of the Nation, because the work that we do is funded through people like Bill supporting our charity. Now, I don't take a wage, I don't take a salary from Heart of the Nation. I do this on a volunteer basis. So this is not about me making a job for myself. It's a big job, but it's not about a paid job. But this is about helping people understand how they can play their part in the chain of survival, designing good outcomes with people like Frank Pangello. Now, I had nothing to do with this, I've got to tell you. This bill that Frank put before Parliament began before I'd even had my cardiac arrest. And it wasn't until later that year in 2020 that Frank or somebody from his office reached out and said, would you come over here and help to raise awareness about the bill? And this is where I'm going to acknowledge, I think it was St John Ambulance who did a lot of work with you before I came on the scene. They did a lot of work to help support Frank in what he did. It's groundbreaking legislation. Like, I can't overstate this. And that's why I'm in awe of what Frank has done. I mean, getting anything through Parliament's a hell of a job, let alone this, that hasn't been done anywhere in Australia before. And I will get Frank to talk about that legislation, but just let me say this. The fact that it has passed means that here in South Australia, your community, your citizens, your residents will have greater chances of survival. Our friends from ambulance, when they're turning up to cardiac arrest now, there's going to be a greater chance that somebody may have used an AED on that patient and made their job just that little bit easier and help that person along their journey in that chain of survival. So we have a number of initiatives, and I know Josh wanted me to talk about some of these, but it's not about that for me. It's not about what we do. It's about how we communicate with the public and raise awareness. And the fact that you're here tonight, I hope you can tell how passionate I am about this subject matter. And I want you to take some of what you've heard away with you tonight and share that information with friends, with family, with whoever you can. Because the more people that understand any attempt at resuscitation is better than no attempt, the more people that understand you don't need to be qualified in CPR to try and save somebody's life with your 2 hands. The more people that know that no training is required to use an AED at all, the better the chances are that we can design those good outcomes for the community. I will just speak quickly about these though. The world's largest CPR class is something that we began for that very reason, to educate people that any attempt at resuscitation is better than no attempt. It began as a live stream event on YouTube back in 2020, and we had about 24,000 people log on and watch Richard Wilkins and myself talk about sudden cardiac arrest and give a demonstration of how to do CPR and use an AED. Channel 9 did it the following year, 2021, and they did it again 2022, so it became a national thing. It ran for about an hour and a half actually on Channel 9. I don't think there's ever been a 1.5 hour TV special dedicated to sudden cardiac arrest anywhere else in the world, but we've done it here in Australia, and it's quite interesting. So I have said to Channel 9, I said, look, I think we could pull it back to an hour. I think that's enough. An hour and a half might be a bit long. But anyway, then the next thing in the middle there, that sticker is what we encourage people to do. Register their AEDs with Heart of the Nation, and we'll send you out those stickers to put on the outside of your business, on the window or the door, so that anybody walking past, they don't have to be a customer, anybody can see that sign and know there is an AED inside that business. Now that is something that is part of Frank's legislation, not to register it with us, but to make sure that there is a sign on the outside of a building so that anybody knows where to find that AED. Because tragically, up until this legislation passes, or was enacted, I should say, if you go into somebody's building and they have an AED, invariably it's in a back room, it's in an office, it's in a drawer, it's in a cupboard, it's somewhere where it is not visible. We need to make these things a lot more visible. And so because we have a database of around 7,000 AEDs around the country now, we do have an app that shows the location of those AEDs, and we're talking to our friends at Ambulance about how we can share that data that we have that relates to South Australia and make it publicly available so that everyone can benefit from this. That's what this is all about, designing those good outcomes. Well, that's another initiative that we have, and this is the one that national pharmacies have been very good to support us with those AEDs and those bright yellow cabinets on the outside of their pharmacies. And actually, Rotary here in South Australia, I'm here for an event tomorrow with them as well. They're supporting us with this program, and they've rolled out, I think, about 17 of these packages now throughout parts of South Australia, and there's 2 or 3 other residents here in South Australia that have these in their street. So somebody has put one on the outside of their home, on their wall, so it can be accessible 24/7 for them and their neighbours. Now, this is why we do it, because the community are the heart of the nation. Not me, not my story. It's everybody's story to own. This space is not owned by Ambulance. It's not owned by anybody. They play their part. We all have to play our part. Frank has played his part. We are all the community that are responsible for putting those links in the chain of survival in place. And together we can do it because we are the heart of the nation. So when it comes to heart stoppers that become showstoppers, we need to acknowledge the real stars of the show. And that's all of those people that, in my case, played their part in the chain of survival. But in the general community's case, the stars of the show are you, each and every one of you, because you are here tonight. You can all play a role in the chain of survival. People like Bill, people like our friends from Ambulance, people like Frank, Josh, Stephen and Brandon. Everyone can do something to raise awareness, to get involved and to help design good outcomes for the community. Thank you very much.